Hey everyone, thanks for joining our first podcast in a series with Mike Rogers. We're excited to have you here and even more excited to have Mike Rogers here with us. Mike Rogers has over 50 years of bonsai experience, which is nearly unbelievable. And he's still very active in the bonsai scene and with his own nursery. We're excited to be able to explore a number of topics over this series with Mike Rogers and get his insights over the years, specifically for Southeast United States bonsai practice and many Florida native species. So thank you for riding along. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Glad to hear it. So would you mind giving an introduction, a bit about you? I'll start you off. Mike pioneered growing of azalea bonsai in Southeast Florida and is considered an expert on azaleas in this area of the country. He's had over 30 trees accepted into the Epcot exhibit, which is a bonsai exhibit at Epcot here in Florida. Those exhibits receive many submissions and they're independently selected by a group of judges. He's had over 30 trees accepted during his practice of bonsai over the 50 years, which is exceptional. That's over 30 years of being selected for a display there. And Mike has worked at a number of bonsai nurseries, run his own bonsai nursery, and worked on a huge array of species. He doesn't necessarily specialize in any one species or any group of species and really is a well-rounded bonsai artist. Mike, anything you'd like to add and tell us more about yourself and your background as we head into this series?
I'm originally from Fort Lauderdale, moved up to D-Land in 1991, so I'm originally from Florida.
Very good. So today's episode, we're going to talk about understanding the stages of tree refinement, from raw stock to development to exhibit-ready trees, focusing on long-term planning, structural decisions, and the nuanced work that comes along with, well, each stage, but especially the refinement and exhibit-ready phase of bonsai. This episode will explore the developmental timeline of bonsai and the mindset shifts that need to occur throughout the stages of development. So if you've ever wondered why some trees stall in development and never quite arrive at show quality, this is a great episode for you. Let's kind of start with the big picture. In Japanese bonsai, the tree's journey is often broken down into three stages: development, refinement, and maintenance. Each stage demands different horticulture and artistic approaches, especially in Florida's climate here, where trees grow so aggressively. That impacts our decision making. So, Mike, how do you define the key stages of a tree's development? How do you know when a tree's ready to move from one phase to the next in your own collection?
Well, the first stage is developing the trunk. You move it to the next stage when the trunk is the size you want, and then you put it in a smaller pot and start growing branches. Some trees are easier to grow branches than others, so depending on the species of tree, then you have to use different techniques, especially for growing pines or junipers. Most time people grow pines and junipers, by the time they get a trunk they want, all the lower branches are all gone, so sometimes you have to graft.
And some trees take a lot longer to develop a trunk size you're looking for that puts the tree in scale as a finished tree, depending on its foliage size and flowering size, etc. Some trees really build trunks pretty quickly.
Well, also you have to consider that the faster you grow a trunk, the less character you're going to have. So a lot of people will just put a tree in the ground and grow it out as fast as they can, and then you get a tree with no movement, no taper, no character. So the slower you grow the trunk, it's kind of a balancing act. You grow it fast enough to where you can get a trunk, but not so fast that you have no character to the trunk. Some people will wound it here and there, grow extra branches and cut them off and get character like that with extra wounds. There's all kinds of different things you can do to get character in a trunk. If you grow it too fast, you wind up with a trunk with not much character.
That's a great point. And growing slower gives you more opportunity to work that trunk throughout the process. Can you give us an example from your own collection where a tree taught you about rushing or delaying that transition?
I've grown trees in the ground. I've grown trees in 20, 30 gallon pots, and they're all different. the best way to get a nice trunk with more character is to have multiple trunks that you can grow out and get a nice base and then start taking those trunks off and wind up with one trunk with good taper and good movement. You don't really need, unless you're going to grow a small little showness. Most trees don't grow like that in nature.
S curves, excessive
Especially
movement.
all these things you get from China, they're all S curves, and basically you can take an air layer those things off at each curve and wind up with a tree with a fair amount of movement, and then you would have more than one tree.
Yeah.
But, S curve is just, trees just don't grow like that.
And same with the coils,
Yeah.
right? Which you see a lot from the Vietnamese imports and so forth.
Yeah.
Even here in our nursery, my nursery, right, we often will take an S curve or coiled tree and, just as Mike suggested, air layer it. You may end up with two smaller trees, but ultimately better trees that don't have the predictable movement of an S curve or coiled trunk. And I think that's an important part of that, right? Is how predictable is it? If you're making trees that all look the same, and if the viewer can predict from the bottom half of the tree what the top half of the tree is going to look like, that's not very interesting,
Yeah.
right? What's interesting is movement, even if it's excessive movement, even if it is coiled and contorted to great lengths, you still want to avoid kind of the repeating coil pattern or the repeating S pattern, and add some varying radius to the curves. You might want to have a tight curve here and then go into a wider curve right after that, but never kind of repeating the same movement. It's really, how do we attract people to bonsai? What makes a good bonsai? It's an interesting tree. And if it's predictable, that takes the interest away from it, don't you think?
Yeah, you wind up with a symmetrical tree with that kind of movement, and really bonsai should be asymmetry. You don't want symmetry. A lot of people will buy a stock tree from a nursery that has good movement at the base, and then they just grow the top straight. So you wind up with two different trees. You wind up with a tree that's got good movement at the bottom and the top is just straight. It will never look good like that.
Yeah, and we were kind of getting into the topics of design and aesthetics a little bit here, which is really for later in the series. But it is relevant as you're looking to develop stock, whether you're growing from cutting, as Mike Rogers has done in many cases, or you're grabbing trees from the nursery stock or buying pre-bonsai. It is relevant to think about how we develop it for a long-term aesthetic. So let's talk about the developmental stage. Many growers start ramifying a tree before it has a strong trunk or primary branch structure. And in the tropical climates like we're in, or subtropical, growth is abundant, but structure requires a lot of discipline. Mike, what are your top priorities when working with raw material?
Well, you have to get taper. So if you start with a tree that doesn't have very good taper, then you have to have some sacrifice branches that you're going to cut off and get taper. Even if you don't have movement, you need taper. So you have to have branches that you're going to get rid of that also gives you character when you cut them off, and it gives you taper. That's the primary concern, depending on the size of the tree. But even a big tree, you want it to taper from the bottom to the top, because you don't want the same taper all the way up. The only trees that grow like that are the trees that grow for pines for telephone poles. They grow straight up and they get no taper, but that doesn't make a very good bonsai.
Sure. And how do you manage the rapid growth that we have here in Florida without losing taper proportion?
You have to
Cut back?
grow and cut. That's just the way bonsai is developed here, especially here. You grow and cut. Like the only thing you can do.
So even if you're buying nursery stock, you still have the same process that you have if you're growing from a cutting. You buy nursery stock, you may be skipping the first phase, essentially, but you still need to cut back typically on your nursery stock to get taper, because rarely do you find good taper in nursery stock already.
Yeah, every now and then you can find a good tree in a nursery somewhere. If people are growing it for bonsai, then you have a better chance, but then you're going to spend more money. If you go to a regular nursery, you're going to be really lucky to find a tree that has a good base and a good bottom part of the trunk. Everything else you're going to have to develop yourself.
Yeah, and that's definitely been my experience. You know, even when you find a good tree in the nursery, there's still a lot of work to be done before it's ready to move to the refinement stage. So are there a lot of mistakes you commonly see when people try to jump into refinement too early?
When you go to refinement, you should already have your trunk and all your branches. If you don't have all your branches, then you have nothing to refine. Refinement is done at the ends of the branches. So if you buy a pre-bonsai or you're developing pre-bonsai, you're developing a trunk with all the branches you need to work that tree. Once you get to that point, then you can start refinement. But you don't want to do refinement in a big pot. When you start refinement, you put it in a bonsai pot. Because trees in big pots, you have a tendency to neglect, let them grow. Once you start refinement, that's development part is over.
It's growing too fast in that large pot to
Exactly.
do the refinement, even if you stay on top of it. Yeah, that makes sense.
So once you start refinement and start wiring a tree, put it in a bonsai pot, even if it's an oversized bonsai pot, and put it on a bench, you're more likely to pay attention to it.
So your order of operations when you're picking up a tree from a nursery stock, is typically going to be, based on what we've discussed, I think developing taper and movement
Yep.
is your first
Yep.
thing. Then you need to develop your primary branches.
Yep.
And you really shouldn't start thinking about refinement until you have those things in place.
Everything. You need all your branches. Your trunk is done. You have all the branches you need. Then you put it in a bonsai pot, even if it's an oversized bonsai pot, and start refinement.
Yeah, like a bonsai training pot,
Yeah.
essentially, yeah. We didn't mention grafting, right? So if you've got your trunk, you got your taper and movement, you have maybe some of your primary branches, but you're missing a key primary branch. One of your options would be to graft in a branch there on most species, right?
Right.
Which of course you need to have the material to graft on.
Right.
So you would need a cutting that's the right size
Yeah.
for that graft
Right.
branch to be.
Yeah, when you're grafting, you really don't want to, you're going to be grafting something that is smaller than you want to work on. When you start grafting large things, it gets a lot more difficult. So, graft something that's smaller than a pencil, and then once it takes and it's growing on the tree, then you grow it out and start developing that branch.
So now you've developed taper and movement, you've set your primary branches, whether that was a selection of what was there or you've grafted some into place. Now you're truly ready to start refinement, right, at this point.
Right.
Once that structure's in place and you start refinement, the tree's going to need a different type of attention. When you decide a tree's ready for refinement, what changes in your horticulture practices? Obviously, you mentioned moving to a bonsai pot, maybe bonsai soil. What other things are changing in your practices after that transition?
Well, the main thing is bonsai soil. When you're growing a tree fast and developing it, if you're using a gravel mix like we use in bonsai pots, then you would want to use something with larger particles. The water-air mixture and exchange in the soil is important to keep the tree growing. The bigger your particles of soil, the more exchange you're going to have between water and oxygen, so the tree's going to grow faster. Once you start refinement, you want to reduce the size of your soil so that it doesn't dry out so fast and there's less exchange between water and oxygen. That slows the tree growing. You also want to reduce the amount of nitrogen you're giving it. That also reduces the speed that it grows. Once you start refinement, you want to slow it down unless you have only 4 or 5 trees. If you have a lot of trees, then you really want them to slow down and not overgrow the refinement that you're trying to put in there.
And that's going to help you maintain short internodes.
Yeah.
How does your wiring technique or pruning approach change once you've entered the refinement stage?
Well, you don't really start wiring that much until you enter the refinement stage anyway. You can wire your,
Maybe for trunk
your
movement.
branches, just to get them going. What we call the first wiring is the structural wiring. Basically, what you're trying to do is get all your branches going in this direction you want them to go.
So you might wire a branch down if it's
Yeah.
going up. You may have wired your trunk at some point to put movement into it, but really the real wiring doesn't start happening until you've got it in a bonsai pot and you've started refinement.
Right.
And what about pruning?
Well, you've grown all your branches, and you have to grow them out to get the branches the right size for the tree. The first stage of refinement is to basically cut most of those branches short, because if you have movement and taper in your trunk, you also want movement and taper in your branches. So if you just wire a branch out, even if you put movement in it, you can't put the kind of movement in it that would look natural as if you cut back to a side branch and then wire that side branch out. You just can't get that naturalness. So basically, once you start refining, then you really want to cut most of your branches pretty short so that they bud out, and you grow them out again. It's a multi-year task to get it to bud out. You build your branches a lot slower than you built the trunk and the base of your branches. Otherwise, you're just going to wind up with branches with big ends. You really don't want that. You want the branches to taper to a really fine point, and it doesn't look natural for a branch to be big all the way out to the end. So you want the branch to naturally taper from the base of the branch out to the ends. In order to do that, you have to cut back. That's the main reason why we want inside growth, is because that always gives you something to cut back to.
So would you typically do the cut back on the primary branches for taper more towards the end of the development phase?
When you put it in a bonsai pot, you really want to cut it back hard so that you can start getting refined.
So this is the beginning of the refinement
beginning
phase.
of the refinement.
So your beginning of the refinement phase is structural. Then from there you start to...
The structure is pretty much the end of the development phase. Once you put it into a smaller pot and you're really wanting to refine it, it becomes refinement. So once you start refinement, all the structure should be there.
Gotcha. So your branches should be there. They should be structured. You're putting in a bonsai pot, and if needed, you're cutting back those primary branches for taper, and then you start building out refinement from there.
Right.
Talk us through how, once you've got those primary branches kind of set, you've cut them back for taper, you're growing out the extensions with some movement. What does the pruning look like from there on out to build the ramification, and what the wiring looks like?
You're wiring smaller branches, they're going to thicken pretty fast, so you really have to keep on top of the wiring. You may have to wire it several times a year, which a lot of people don't like wiring that much, but the more often you wire, the better it is, because you wind up with less wire scars and your branches develop naturally. You can put better movement into a smaller branch than a large branch, but they thicken faster, so you have to keep on top of the wiring. Otherwise, you wind up with big wire scars.
For certain species, ficus, cypress, but really any species, even juniper, what kind of adjustments to this timeline that we've discussed have to be made because of how they grow, particularly here in Florida?
Especially with ficus and most of the tropical trees, they're top dominant trees, and your top is going to get heavy more than the bottom. So you have to control the top more. But even if you do control the top more, which you really need to do, you're going to wind up eventually with big branches in the top of your tree that you're going to have to just take out and replace periodically. That's just the way trees grow down here. Up north, they can go 10 years without repotting a tree. We repot every year. The trees grow at a rate to where the pot fills up with roots, and once it fills up with roots, then basically the tree stops growing. Of course, ficus can grow through the bottom. If you're not watching, a ficus root can grow down the bench and reach the ground and, keep on growing.
Yeah, I've seen that at nurseries where the ficus that are on the benches have actually grown down into the ground and become permanent, grown out of the pot, and have become permanent fixtures on the bench. Yeah.
So you have to watch all that.
What about juniper, something that's slower growing, and how do you have any adjustments to your timeline for something like that?
No, basically junipers, the strength of the juniper is in the foliage, so you want to let it grow. Basically, I trim my junipers in May and October. The rest of the year, they're just growing. Back when we first started doing bonsai in Florida in the early 70s, some people started earlier, but I started in the early 70s. There were a few people that were more advanced than I was in Florida, but people didn't know how to trim junipers, so they wanted to pinch and get nice tight pads, and they just pinched them tight all year. I saw some really good junipers back then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that just weakened and died because they never had a chance to grow. They were continually pinched and they were never let grow. The foliage never had a chance to mature and start producing the chemicals for the tree to grow. So they eventually weakened and died.
Yeah, that's a great point, because here at my nursery, based on your advice, that's what we do is we trim twice a year. After some time passes from your early season trimming, before you get to the October pruning, those trees start to look a little shabby. They're not always in great shape. I mean, they're in good shape, but they don't always look tight and hold their design aesthetic throughout the year. But we don't trim them to keep them looking great all year because it would weaken the tree. How does that change if you're planning to take a tree to show? Would you take a year, if you're planning to show a tree in a year, would you be more aggressive at the risk of weakening the tree a little bit? Be more aggressive in pinching or trimming, knowing that next year I'm not going to show the tree and let it recover vigor?
Well, the whole idea of bonsai, and some people wince when you say this, but the whole idea of bonsai is to weaken the tree. If you're going to put a tree in a show, you should start preparing it a year or two before the show. You can't keep all of your trees show ready on your benches, year after year after year. They're just going to weaken and you start losing branches, and sometimes you lose trees. You have to let trees grow.
So there's a cycle. Even if you have a tree that's immaculate, ready for show, you may have put 1 or 2 years of weakening that tree into that. You're going to show that tree for a year, maybe two, but then it needs to take a step back, go maybe into a training pod and be let to grow for a year, without as much work done on it to ensure that the vigor is maintained, you don't lose your core structure, and that the tree can live to show itself again, right?
Yeah, when you want to put a tree in a show, you want it in the exact pot it should be in. And when you're done with the show, you can actually put it in a larger pot and let it grow back out. Trees shouldn't be show ready on your benches year after year after year.
Yeah, sometimes it's not very feasible to keep the tree in the pot that you're going to show it in permanently. Sometimes that would, even if it is feasible, it might be very high workload to keep it watered and so forth.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it would weaken the tree over time to keep it in some of the pots that you see trees shown in. So that's one of the things about bonsai that people often don't understand when they're new, is that what you see in pictures doesn't represent the full life cycle of the tree in any way, shape, or form, right?
Those trees that you see in pictures have been worked on for a year or two. Then they take the picture, they put it in a show, take the picture, and then they put it back into a larger pot and let it grow back out. Even the pictures you see in the books from Japan, those trees don't look like that all year after year. They put them in the larger pot, let them grow back out, and then when they want to put them in a show, they work on them again hard.
So the leap from a well-developed tree to an actual exhibit-worthy tree is usually about detail, right? It's nabari, silhouette, branch density, ultimately working the tree much harder than you would in the developmental phases. So how do you train yourself to see a finished exhibit-ready tree kind of image in your head years before the tree's ready or at that point?
Well, the best way to train yourself to see the future of a tree is to look at pictures of good trees. I still subscribe to Bonsai Focus. Back when it first started, it was Bonsai Today. You look at pictures of good trees that are finished, and then you start getting an image. You train your mind to where you can see forward of a tree and see where it's going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's just not something that you can do in a year or two.
So it's, looking at trees over the long haul, but I mean, does growing a species out from kind of cutting to at least beginning of refinement tree, does that process help you to have a frame of reference for how things should look over time and how they could be developed once you've actually developed some trees?
Well, when you're growing trees out, you really need a plan as to where that tree is going from the beginning. Otherwise, it's just growing at haphazard. If you want to have the best outcome, then you have to put the best work on it as it goes. So you have to train yourself, even if you're beginning, you have to start training yourself to see where a tree is going to go and where you want it to go and work on that.
Yeah. And there's a book called Harry Harrington's Bonsai Inspirations, I believe is the name of it. And I believe there's a volume 1 and 2. I found that book useful. It's not a teaching book per se. It doesn't teach you how to do bonsai. It's really a book for inspiring you. But to Mike's point, it's a great opportunity to look at finished trees and help you build a vision for what can be and should be for your own trees. So, Mike, what are some of the subtle elements like apex character or branch line that separate, good bonsai from truly great one?
Well, we don't really call it apex anymore. Back in the 70s and 80s, everybody would just wire up one little top and call that the apex. But as we've developed, trees don't unless you have something like a Norfolk Island pine or some of the spruces, they grow straight up and they have one little point at the top, which would be the apex. But most of the trees we work with have a rounded crown. So that's really what you want to work with towards on all the trees. They have a rounded crown, and so you want to develop trees so that you don't have just one little apex sticking up there. You have several, 4 or 5, even 6 or 7 branches up there that are all going up. So you wind up with a rounded crown, not just an apex.
And so what do you think some of the different characteristics that separate an average or even good tree from a great top quality tree?
Well, the thing about it is the refinement stage. Of course, when you're growing the structure, you want to put branches where you're going to need branches. And then once you start working on the refinement, you just refine the whole thing from the top to the bottom. If the bottom branch is not as refined as the top, it's not going to look good. If the top is not as refined as the bottom, people start working on the bottom branch because that's first in the development part. And then it takes several years to get the final top refined the way you want it.
Yeah, and if at any point you kind of try to hurry up, as we say, and finish your tree, you're ultimately going to reduce the long-term quality of that tree because, as you mentioned earlier, if you have a trunk with great movement, you should have movement all the way through all your branches, all the way through your primaries, your tertiaries, your apex branches, all of that. And taper, if you have taper in the tree. Then obviously you can have straighter branches, but matching up that character all the way throughout the tree, all the way to the final stages of refinement is something that separates a good tree from a great tree, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Have you ever taken a tree to show and later afterwards felt like, it really wasn't ready for show yet? And what did that teach you?
Well, I have a big Green Island ficus that I bought as a huge stump and grew it out and grew out the bottom branch. And when I finished it, I knew that that bottom branch was too straight, but I put it in a BSF show anyway. And when I think they had Boone there doing their exhibit critique, the first thing he said was that bottom branch is too straight, which I knew it was when I put it in there. And when he said it, it just amplified it. So I took it home and cut the branch shorter and regrew. It took me 5-6 years to regrow that branch to where it had movement and taper.
And so, having known that it was an issue, Boone, who's a great artist, kind of reinforced that. And what your takeaway was, maybe in the future, you should trust your gut.
Yeah.
Trust your gut on things a little bit. That's good advice. What are some practical takeaways for the audience that we can finish up with? I mean, one of the biggest challenges for serious bonsai artists is knowing where to focus their time and energy.
Right.
We only have so much, and we often have more trees that we could do more things on than we have the time for. particularly here in the US, without apprentices, working for very low cost. And with most artists having a full-time job aside from bonsai that they need to tend to. So let's distill this down for the audience. If you only had 15 minutes with someone's collection, what would you look at to diagnose whether a tree's in development, refinement, or maintenance, and give them guidance on how to proceed with their collection?
Once you have developed trees to where they're at the refinement stage, then you can look at a tree and see that it's either in the development or refinement.
The trunks,
yeah,
the nabari's in place.
That everything's there, and if it's
branches are in place.
Refinement, you know it's in refinement. If the owner says it's in refinement, and there's several parts of the tree that need development, then you can say that.
How would you determine the difference between being in refinement and in maintenance mode?
Well, refinement is maintenance.
So you don't think there's ever a point where you've got your refinement done and you're just trying to keep it intact?
When it comes time to repot a tree, you work on that tree, you put it on a turntable or whatever you're using to work on it, and you look at it. You look at every aspect of the tree, and it doesn't matter if you've been refining the tree for 10 years. Sometimes you can spot something that needs to be cut back harder, and maybe even go back into one or two branches into a development stage. Branches, like I said earlier, get heavier. That's just the way trees grow fast here in Florida, and branches get heavier, and sometimes you just have to cut them back harder. So every time you go to repot a tree, you look at it hard and see if there's something that really needs to be done to improve the tree.
And even in Japan, they have trees that are hundreds of years old that have won shows, and then they all of a sudden get taken all the way back to the development phase and redesigned, because when you're dealing with trees over hundreds of years, they're never truly finished. And sometimes they are just taking a short step back into refinement from the maintenance side, but sometimes you're doing a whole redesign of a tree when you're dealing with trees over a long enough period of time. And so really a tree is only finished if it dies, because the work to maintain, refine, or even go all the way back through to development and redesign the tree is a perpetual process, right?
Yep.
I guess we'll finish off today with one last question for you. So if you had one piece of advice you could give to someone, or that you wish someone had told you about long-term development of bonsai when you started out, what would that be?
Don't rush. You really get into trouble when you try to rush something. You cut back something, and then as soon as it starts budding out, once you cut something back pretty hard, it really needs to regain its strength. If you come back in there and as soon as it starts leafing out, you're cutting it again, a tree's going to weaken and die. Nothing happens in a month, 2, 3, even 6 months sometimes. You do something to a tree, give it time to recover. One saying is, one big thing a year. If you do something big to a tree, give it a year to recover and start working on it again.
So don't get in a hurry would be and don't try to develop, great trees really quickly, because great trees don't get developed quickly.
Right.
Good stuff. And that's coming from someone who's grown more show quality bonsai trees from cutting than anyone I've ever met. Mike Rogers has how many trees would you say you have that you grew from cutting that are
I don't even know.
in good shape? Hundreds. Yeah. Hundreds of nice trees that he's grown for 20, 30 plus years from a cutting. So he really understands the development of trees well and has the experience to give that advice. I think that wraps up today's podcast. Thank you, Mike, for being here and doing this. Thank you guys for listening. We'll be back again soon with another episode with Mike as we work through this series where we'll address many topics that are of interest to not just beginners, but intermediate and even advanced professional artists. Thanks you guys again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.